Góðan daginn og velkomin til Reykjavíkur. Welcome to Reykjavik, the capital city of Iceland. Home to just under 2/3 of the entire country's population, Reykjavik is the northernmost capital city on Earth. And on this walk around the city on a gorgeous winter's afternoon, we'll make our way across snowy parks and along historic streets as we uncover the sights and stories which make up this enchanting Nordic city. We'll admire Reykjavik's beautiful nature, from near frozen lakes to the glistening waters of the bay. We'll visit some of the city's oldest and most important buildings, from the National Parliament to the Prime Minister's office. And we'll take a deep dive into the centuries of riveting history to be found on the city's streets, before we then make our way up towards the mighty Hallgrímskirkja, the tallest church in Iceland and a world-famous symbol of the modern nation. All of that, and so much more, is to come over the next hour as we explore the Icelandic capital in depth. But we begin our walk in the historic heart of Reykjavik, looking towards two of the city's most important landmarks of all. The modestly sized building in front of us here is the home of the Alþingi, Iceland's national parliament. And standing just beside it is the beautiful Reykjavik Cathedral, the oldest church in the whole city. Now these two landmarks stand on one side of what is traditionally considered as Reykjavik's central square, an unassuming open space known as the Austurvöllur, or the East Field, which is covered in a thick layer of ice and snow at the end of a traditionally freezing Icelandic winter. Since it was built in 1881, the Icelandic Parliament House here has witnessed 142 of those frigid winters. But today it stands as a proud symbol of this nation's truly illustrious history. The building that we see today, known as the Alþingishúsið, may only be 142 years old, but the parliament that it houses is much, much older. In fact, the Alþingi claims to be the longest-running national parliament in the whole world, founded nearly 1,100 years ago in the year 930 AD. Back then, and in fact for most of its history, the Parliament actually met in the middle of the Icelandic countryside. But in 1845 it was moved to Reykjavik, initially meeting in a school building a couple of streets away. The Alþingi only took up its famous home on the Austurvöllur here with the construction of the purpose-built Parliament House in the 1880s. And we'll discuss more about this humble National Parliament building in a few minutes' time. But as we mentioned just beside it, there stands Reykjavik Cathedral, the oldest church in the city, which was originally built over a period of 9 years in the last decade of the 18th century. Though it was enlarged in 1847, as recorded on the clock tower, the cathedral is in places nearly 100 years older than the Parliament House just next door. But the cathedral is also an important symbol of how Reykjavik came to be the city it is today, because this was the very first building constructed with a view to establishing Reykjavik here as the capital of Iceland. That's right, Reykjavik hasn't always been Iceland's capital and largest city. In fact, as recently as 300 years ago, what we now know as Reykjavik was almost entirely farmland, spreading out beside a smoky bay. Looking at a map of Iceland, we can see that Reykjavik is located in the very southwest of the country, in the heart of the now mostly urbanised capital region, which is home to around 230,000 people. Remarkably, that's just under 2/3 of Iceland's whole population, with just another 140,000 people living outside this southwestern corner of the island. So you won't find many other urban areas like this among Iceland's vast wilderness. But despite its built-up nature, Reykjavik still has space for nature too, such as here a few metres to the south of the Austurvöllur. Stretching out before us here is Tjörnin, literally the pond, a huge body of water which, at the moment at least, is mostly frozen over. That's all except for a small corner of the pond here, where flocks of ducks, geese and swans cuddle up to the shore, hoping for a few crumbs from the many passers-by taking a stroll around this beautiful lake. The rippling waters and frozen surface of Tjörnin look truly spectacular on a sunny afternoon like this, but surrounding the pond are a number of interesting local landmarks as well. Just here there stands the eye-catching Ráðhúsið, Reykjavik City Hall, which was built back in 1992 in a distinctive modern style, rather unusually appearing to rest directly on top of the pond itself. Elsewhere around the pond, you'll find a wealth of houses, museums, galleries and more, but perhaps most recognisable is the elegant Free Church of Reykjavik just across the water, built in 1903 and famed for its unmistakable green roof and spire. As for the pond itself, it's been a fixture of Reykjavik cityscape since the very beginning, originally formed more than 1200 years ago when it was cut off from the sea. And over the centuries people began building a sparse collection of houses around it, even using its frozen surface for ice skating during the winter months. But in the 21st century, Tjörnin is also well known as the home of a number of famous Icelandic sculptures, few more famous than this unusual work, the monument to the unknown Bureaucrat. Created back in 1994, the sculpture depicts an Icelandic civil servant with a huge block of volcanic rock for a head, humorously depicting the many so-called faceless government workers who walk to work through this part of town with their briefcases every day. Of course, as we now make our way back from the shores of the pond, this part of Reykjavik is well known for its lengthy association with both the city and national government, with many of the country's main political offices to be found on the handful of streets surrounding us. Now, as we know, Iceland is a fairly small nation when it comes to population. Just 375,000 people live in this country, the same number as the city of Coventry in England, for example, or New Orleans in Louisiana, or even Florence in Italy. Because of this, the footprint of the country's government is relatively humble, occupying just a few buildings in the heart of the capital. And even more unusual for those used to the intensely guarded government offices in cities like London and Washington DC, in Reykjavik you can leisurely walk right up to a number of major buildings like the Parliament House. In fact, there's even a lovely little garden to enjoy right behind the place where Iceland's legislators meet. This is Alþingisgarðurinn, a small, snowy open space, which is also the oldest public park in Iceland still preserved in its original condition. Surrounded by a low stone wall, the wonderfully peaceful Alþingisgarðurinn was laid out back in 1894, using funds that had been left over from building the Parliament House itself. Almost entirely unchanged since then, this beautiful and secluded spot in the very heart of the city offers a close-up view of Iceland's National Parliament building. But of course, this wasn't the place where Iceland's historic parliament began. As we mentioned, the Alþingi claims to be the world's longest-running national parliament, originally established all the way back in the year 930 AD, when Scandinavian settlers held their very first assembly at the historic plains of Þingvellir, the Parliament Fields. That's right, before the cosy Parliament House that stands today, Icelandic lawmakers literally met in fields in the middle of the countryside, specifically a location about 50 kilometres inland from Reykjavik here. This form of parliament, known as a thing, was a medieval custom, which became widespread during the Viking Age. In fact, similar things were commonplace across Scandinavia, Greenland, and even Great Britain for hundreds of years. In Iceland, the Alþingi has been held almost uninterrupted since it was first established nearly 1100 years ago. In fact, only for a brief period of 45 years, between 1800 and 1845, did the Alþingi not meet, before it eventually reconvened in Reykjavik and has been running continuously ever since. Now here we find the modern entrance to the Alþingishúsið, although today the historic Parliament House actually only hosts the country's main debate chamber and a handful of offices, The rest of the government spread out among the buildings surrounding the Austurvöllur, as we mentioned earlier. Standing directly in front of the entrance to Parliament, meanwhile, there stands a statue of Ingibjörg H. Bjarnason, a leading figure of Iceland's suffragette movement, and the very first woman to be elected to the Alþingi back in 1922. That was just 4 years after Iceland became an independent nation, first gaining independence from Denmark in the year 1918. In the 105 years since then, Iceland has had plenty of ups and downs, and one of its most dramatic episodes of all is commemorated just here. This monument is known as the Black Cone, and it pays tribute to the thousands of people who turned out in protests and acts of civil disobedience during the so-called Pots and Pans Revolution of 2009. Named for the noisy pots and pans that protesters clanged while standing on the Austurvöllur, what started out as a one-man protest grew into one of the largest periods of instability in the history of independent Iceland, as the nation's population grew increasingly infuriated with the way its government handled the fallout from the 2008 financial crisis. By and large, as we make our way off the city's central square, these protests were a success. The Icelandic government resigned in 2009, and after initially being one of the worst-hit countries in the world by the financial crisis, a decade of sustainable growth followed, as Iceland has developed a diverse economy that encompasses traditional agriculture and fishing, manufacturing, and increasingly, tourism. Nearly 2 million people visit Iceland every year, and while many of course come to experience the staggering natural landscape of this volcanic island, there's plenty of intriguing heritage to be found on the streets of its cities as well. Just here, for example, is a small square known as Víkurgarður, the site of one of the earliest buildings in Reykjavik. It was right here that the Víkurkirkja, the original church of Reykjavik, stood for more than 500 years, originally constructed by medieval settlers in the 12th century. It was eventually demolished in 1796, when it was replaced by Reykjavik Cathedral. But where the church once stood, we now find this statue of a man named Skúli Magnússon, often referred to as the father of Reykjavik. Throughout the 18th century, Magnússon became renowned for his role in fighting corruption in Iceland, when the island was ruled by the Kingdom of Denmark. In 1749, he was appointed as governor of Iceland, the first Icelander to hold the title, and he immediately decided to establish a large trading port in the southwest of the island here, building factories and warehouses where there had for centuries been just a sparse collection of farms. This was the beginning of the city of Reykjavik that we know today, and as the population grew here over the course of 250 years, new streets were laid out and ever larger buildings were constructed. Reykjavik remains an ever-changing city, but remarkably there is just one building from the time of Skúli Magnússon still standing here, and that is this humble black house at number 10 Aðalstræti. Dating back to 1762, this timber house is the oldest building in downtown Reykjavik, and it's had quite the history. When it was built, Reykjavik was barely big enough to even call it a village, but this building became one of the first small factories established by Skúli Magnússon, initially used for the production of wool. Later on in life, it was used as a house, most famously serving as the home of Jón Sigurðsson, the leader of Iceland's independence movement in the 19th century. We'll talk more about him when we return to the Austurvöllur later on in our walk. But speaking of the historic East Field, it was once much bigger than what we know today, stretching out to roughly this point in Reykjavik, where the terrain begins to rise ever so slightly. This street is known as Grjótagata, as it leads into a distinctive little neighbourhood of Reykjavik by the name of Grjótaþorp. Now this mostly residential part of the city can trace its origins back to a small farmstead, which stood at the top of this once rocky slope. But as commercial development began in the late 18th century, a number of earthen houses were built on this hill. These houses became the homes of fishermen and labourers working locally, many in Skúli Magnasson's factories, and so the area evolved into Grjótaþorp, literally the village on the rocks. By the early 19th century, nearly 200 people were living in a couple of dozen small houses dotted around the hill here. But eventually, the old turf houses were demolished and replaced with larger wooden homes. Although today, those wooden houses are covered top to bottom in delightfully colourful corrugated iron. The multicoloured houses of Grjótaþorp make it one of Reykjavik's quaintest neighbourhoods, but it also displays a rather interesting feature of many Icelandic houses. Across the country, you'll notice a relative lack of forests, and as a result, trees, which can be used for building houses. So for much of Iceland's history, people lived in houses made out of turf, earth and mud, which also provided good protection and insulation from the bitterly cold winds and rains of the Icelandic winter. But when wooden houses became more common in the 19th century, people noticed that timber didn't insulate against the elements quite as well, so they began cladding their homes in corrugated iron to keep themselves warm and dry throughout the year. These so-called ironclads are today a defining feature of Reykjavik's oldest streets, most built between the 1880s and 1920s, and usually painted in an array of wonderfully bright colours. Just here in red, for example, we find the home of another notable Icelander, the writer Benedict Gröndal, who lived here for nearly 20 years between 1888 and 1907. Gröndal was a prolific author who contributed greatly to Icelandic literature, while he also translated a number of foreign works into the Icelandic language, most famously the works of the ancient Greek poet Homer. Now, for an island with such a small population, Iceland is home to quite a remarkable literary history. In fact, it's said that 1 in every 10 Icelanders will publish a book at some point during their lifetime. A local saying even asserts that everyone in Iceland is að ganga með bók í maganum. Literally, everyone has a book in their stomach. But this love for literature is nothing new. Icelanders have been writing for centuries, and the country is world famous as the home of the Icelandic sagas, a collection of texts written in the medieval era, which tell stories based on the events that were unfolding on this island during the first few centuries of Scandinavian settlement. They're an invaluable resource which helps us to look back to the earliest period of Iceland's history, featuring the stories of early Norse settlers like Ingólfur Arnarson, who lends his name to this small Reykjavik square, known as Ingólfstorg. A powerful chieftain originally from Norway, Ingólfur Arnarson is commonly credited as the first permanent settler of Iceland, and in the year 874 AD, after sailing across the sea, he chose to establish a farm on this wild island. According to the sagas, to decide where to build his farm, Arnarson threw the wooden pillars of his throne into the water, and wherever they washed up on shore was where he would settle. And as luck would have it, the pillars were found washed up here in Reykjavik. Of course, things are vastly different more than 1,000 years later. Hot dog stalls stand where sheep once grazed, but the street here, Aðalstræti, is commonly recognised as the oldest street in Reykjavik today, marking the traditional centre point of the city. For most of Reykjavik's history, Aðalstræti here was a simple dirt path, which farmers used to walk from their farms to their boats, which were moored just a short distance away from here. In a few moments, we too are going to make our way towards the waters of Reykjavik's harbour. But the dirt path once trodden by local farmers now finds itself at the centre of a vast web of streets. And just here, Aðalstræti gives way to Vesturgata, another historic lane which is lined by a wealth of fetching buildings. Now, just like in Grjótaþorp, most of the buildings surrounding us here are just over 100 years old, having replaced older wooden shops and dwellings that were built during the first period of development under Skúli Magnusson. But while they may not be the oldest in the city's history, some are worth noting. The bright red house that we can see on our left, for example, is known as the House of the Snowbird, and it was built back in 1896 by the beloved Icelandic poet Einar Ben, a leading figure of the country's literary revival in the early 20th century. But another interesting point about the House of the Snowbird there is that it's one of many large ironclad houses around Reykjavik, which were originally designed and built more than 1,000 kilometres away, in Norway. Norway, with its vast forests, was the perfect place to source much-needed timber for houses in Iceland. And so around the turn of the 20th century, it became increasingly fashionable to buy so-called catalogue houses, prefabricated houses which were designed in Norway and then simply shipped over to Iceland in bits, ready to be quickly constructed, either in city centres like Reykjavik or further out in the countryside. There are plenty of Norwegian catalogue houses which still stand on Reykjavik streets. In many cases, they're among the fanciest dwellings in the city, and they include the famous Höfði House on the eastern side of Reykjavik, which was once the home of the poet Einar Ben, but is likely best known around the world as the venue for the summit between US President Ronald Reagan and the Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev back in 1986, which was an important stepping stone towards ending the Cold War. Now, we won't quite have time to visit Höfði House on our walk today, but it's one of a number of famous local landmarks which stand on Reykjavik's lengthy waterfront. And just here we find ourselves at one of the busiest parts of the city's legendary coastline. Close to the centre of the city here, you'll find Reykjavik's main harbour, which was historically Iceland's main place of trade, but now is surrounded by shops, museums and hotels, many of which cater to tourists who use the harbour as a starting point for one of the many cruises and boat trips that set sail into the waters of the bay. Boat trips from Reykjavik are among the best things to do if you fancy taking a break from the city streets. In the daytime you can spot humpback whales, seals, porpoises and a wide variety of sea life, while during winter nights, boat trips away from the lights of Reykjavik present probably the best way of viewing the Northern Lights in all their glory. If you are visiting Reykjavik, then you'll almost certainly have the chance to venture out on one of the many boat trips available. But even if you don't, you can still enjoy views of the city's harbour from dry land, and get a sense of the heritage of fishing, cross-sea trade and more, which helped this once tiny bayside settlement on its way to becoming the capital of an independent Iceland. Here we stumble across just one part of the city's rather large harbour, a part of the waterfront which can indeed trace its history all the way back to the earliest settlement, but which only began taking the shape that we see today just over 100 years ago. In fact, the area just behind the boats and pier that we can see in the middle distance is known as the Old Harbour, and it was opened back in 1917. Now, for centuries before then, marine vessels were the only link between Iceland and the outside world. But with no proper port for large merchant ships to dock and offload their goods, actually getting things and people in and out of Reykjavik was fairly challenging for a long time. Usually, larger ships would come to a stop in deeper waters just off the coast of Reykjavik, transfer their goods and passengers to smaller rowboats, which would then make their way to the shore here. But as the city grew and international trade became busier as the 20th century rolled around, this system was evidently inadequate. So a modern port was built here on the southern shore of a small fjord, just across the water from the mighty flat-topped mountain known as Esjan, covered in deep snow at the end of a long winter. Now Esjan over there has watched over the city of Reykjavik since its very birth, and this being the capital of Iceland, much of the history of the modern nation as a whole can also be found in this city. We know the story goes that Ingólfur Arnarson, Iceland's first permanent settler, laid down his roots here. But of course, as we've also mentioned, for most of history, Iceland was not an independent nation, rather a distant outpost controlled by a series of Scandinavian kingdoms. Initially, Iceland was ruled by Norway, the origin for many of its settlers, But over time, control shifted further south across Scandinavia towards the city of Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark. The Danes held great power over this North Atlantic island, located more than 1,500 kilometres away from their capital city, and they used it primarily as a source of raw materials and fish for their growing kingdom. In fact, Iceland, as a source of these goods, was so important that the Danes imposed tight controls and restrictions on Icelanders living here, allowing them only to sell their goods to Denmark and nowhere else in Europe. This was a point of major contention for those who lived and worked in Iceland, because fishing was by far and away the main source of income for most families here. The waters surrounding the island, traditionally home to plentiful stocks of cod, halibut, herring, salmon, mackerel, sharks and whales, all of which were eaten by the people here and in Denmark for centuries. So fishermen were absolutely crucial to Reykjavik and Iceland's fortunes, and so it's no surprise that the nation's fishermen are commemorated here by the harbour. This sculpture depicting two local fishermen looking out to sea, against fierce winds and freezing cold waves. Of course, in Iceland's frigid climate, fishing was no easy business. Scores of men lost their lives to the sea on a regular basis. But the harsh winters and chilly temperatures here have also proved an obstacle to many pursuits on dry land as well, namely Iceland's railway network. Now, you don't often hear much about trains in Iceland, and there's a good reason for that. There are none. There used to be, and that's why we've just walked along a seemingly random piece of old railway track. Usually this part of the harbour is home to a cute little locomotive known as Minur, one of two trains which operated on probably the most famous railway in Iceland. It was the Reykjavik Harbour Railway, a tiny 10-kilometre railway line that existed for around 15 years, between 1913 and 1928. And it was built to assist the fast-growing volumes of trade coming in and out of Reykjavik Harbour here. But of course, trains don't mix particularly well with snow and ice, which is around for a good chunk of the year here. So it was eventually decided that the city's railways would be decommissioned, and roads would be used to transport goods around Reykjavik and more widely across Iceland. Today in 2023, there are still no trains operating in all of Iceland, although there are finally plans in place for a light rail system to be built around the heavily urban capital region here, possibly beginning as early as 2026. So you could be riding a train in Iceland for the first time in nearly 100 years fairly soon. But we're now making our way away from the old railway track and the harbour to head back into the streets of Reykjavik city centre. We will return to the waterfront a little later on in our walk, but here we're walking down a small street known as Naustin, a name which literally means the boathouse. Before the modern harbour was built, the shore used to be a little further inland, roughly one city block behind where it is now. And so it was in this part of Reykjavik that you would have once upon a time found many of the local fishermen's boats and boat houses, stored ready to be taken out onto the water for a day's work. Where those boathouses once stood, we now find everything from Irish pubs to souvenir shops and more. Yet another sign of how Reykjavik has now fully embraced tourism as a major source of income, alongside its more traditional industries of fishing and the like. Now, as we've mentioned, and in fact as we've seen from the eye-catching mountain of Esjan across the water, Iceland's main attraction to tourists is its spectacular natural landscape. Volcanoes, fjords, glaciers, waterfalls, and everything in between making up what's popularly known as the land of ice and fire. Excursions to all of those natural wonders depart from Reykjavik city centre every day. But when you return from the wilderness at the end of a long day, you'll likely be looking for somewhere to eat, maybe shop, and certainly drink. And while you will indeed find shops, bars and restaurants all over Reykjavik, there are few parts of the city more popular for that than the street we find just here, Austurstræti. Translating as East Street, the pedestrianised Austurstræti is often one of the liveliest parts of Reykjavik when the sun goes down, popular among tourists and locals alike for its nightlife. But of course, there's much more to this street than first meets the eye. While people keep themselves warm with a drink or a meal in one of the many establishments which line the street, they may not realise that they're surrounded by some of the city's oldest and most fetching buildings. Here on the left, for example, there stands one of the most prominent addresses on the street, number 11 Austurstræti. Originally built in 1915 and gradually extended over the decades, this was for 99 years the headquarters of Landsbankinn, a successor to one of Iceland's oldest and ultimately most controversial banks. Heavily involved in bringing about Iceland's severe financial crisis in 2008, the bank in its new form eventually moved out of the historic headquarters here on Austurstræti in 2023. But the building remains standing just across the street from the eye-catching Posthus food hall in red, a popular city centre eatery that's housed inside what was once Reykjavik's general post office, originally built back in 1914. It wasn't just a post office though. In fact, on the building's top floor, there once lived a woman by the name of Málfríður Einarsdóttir, yet another local literary figure, famed for her works in the 1970s and 1980s. After all, as we know, everybody in Iceland has a book in their stomach. But if you fancy putting something else in your belly, then these two historic houses, a pair of the oldest on the street, are just the place for you. Built roughly 200 years ago, one of these old houses is now home to a bar, and the other to a famous restaurant named Hressingarskálinn, or Hressó for short, where you can warm up with hot drinks, breakfast, delicious cakes, and more. But just next door to it is an even older building, number 22 Austurstræti, originally built in the first decade of the 19th century, when it bizarrely served as the first home of an independent Iceland. The house was once home to a Danish man named Jón Sigurðsson, who landed in Iceland in 1809 on board a British merchant ship, and he decided to declare Iceland as a free state, outside of the control of the Danish king. Now, Jørgensson's audacious declaration of independence was only short-lived. He was arrested by Danish authorities just 2 months into his reign as the self-styled protector of Iceland. But the seemingly sudden eruption of secessionism in Iceland was nothing out of the blue. Frustration with the strict Danish trading monopoly had been building up for decades. We know that Skúli Magnússon, the father of Reykjavik, worked to diminish the monopoly by developing industry here. But it was in the decades after Jón Sigurðsson's 2-month rebellion that Icelandic nationalism really began to get moving, beginning a long road that eventually led to the nation's independence from Denmark in 1918. And today, the government of this independent nation is headed by the Prime Minister of Iceland, whose office is located here, inside this building, Government House. Now, just like the Parliament House a few streets away, you can walk right up to the Prime Minister's office, which is a rather large building that was built back in 1771, although it was originally built to be used as Iceland's very first prison. The prison was unpopular among Reykjavik locals, however, and it closed down after just 45 years. It was only in the 20th century, in 1904 to be exact, that the first Icelandic ministry took up office at Government House. And the building stands at the bottom of Bankastræti here, part of the lengthy shopping street which stretches through Reykjavik's fashionable 101 district, a more modern part of the city that we'll be exploring a little later on our walk, and which will lead us in the direction of the mighty church of Hallgrímskirkja. But before all that, here we find ourselves on a major street known as Lækjargata, beside which you'll find a delightful little playground. Long before this was a playground, however, this was a garden that belonged to Bernhöft's Bakery, the very first bakery in Iceland, which existed as part of the row of historic houses that we can see atop the small hill just here. Together, this park and the row of houses are known as Bernhöft's Sword, the bakery's legacy remaining in place despite the fact that it closed long ago in 1931. When it was open, the bakery saw a number of eclectic neighbours emerge in some rather interesting buildings. The instantly recognisable Gimli building in white here, for example, was built back in 1905, and it was one of the first concrete edifices to be built in a city which at the time was still dominated by wooden, ironclad houses. Now, as well as being one of the oldest rows of houses in Reykjavik, the buildings of Bernhöftsfjord are among the prettiest in the city centre, particularly with the snow-covered lawn stretching out before them and the bright blue sky soaring up above. But the houses also hold the distinction of standing just next door to another crucial landmark in the history of an independent Iceland, the Menntaskólinn, or the Reykjavik Junior College. Built over 2 years between 1844 and 1846, this school building was once the largest wooden building in Iceland, playing home to Iceland's oldest school, the Menntaskólinn, tracing its history all the way back to the 11th century. But it wasn't the school which made this building a point of national significance, rather the return of the Alþingi in 1845. You might remember that the Alþingi, Iceland's parliament, claims to be the longest-running national parliament in the world, but it was briefly interrupted for a period of 45 years, when it was abolished in 1800. However, in July of 1845, the Alþingi was re-established in the school's assembly hall, beginning the core period of Iceland's growing independence movement, as those living here sought freedom from the rule of Denmark. Now, before the purpose-built Alþingishúsið, the school was where the nation's parliament met for the best part of 3 decades, and during that time there emerged an important figure by the name of Jón Sigurðsson, an MP, later Speaker of the Alþingi, but most famously the leader of the movement for Icelandic independence. Born in the wild west fjords of Iceland, Sigurðsson was the man who gave voice to Icelanders' now long-standing grievances with Danish rule, principally leading the nation's push for greater self-rule through democratic institutions like the Alþingi. Now, when the Alþingi was brought back in 1845, many more radical Icelandic nationalists didn't want it to meet in Reykjavik. They were concerned that this city, the main trading link with Denmark, was too Danish. But others believed that by holding the national parliament here, it would help to make Reykjavik more Icelandic. It appears that the plan paid off. The slightly ramshackle revived parliament at the Menntaskólinn was eventually replaced with a proud symbol of domestic rule in the form of Alþingishúsið here on the Austurvöllur, which, as we know, opened its doors back in 1881. Ever since, through good times and bad, the Eastfield here has been at the centre of expressions of national pride and solidarity. So where better to erect a statue of the father of Icelandic nationalism than here, at the heart of the Austurvöllur. Jón Sigurðsson died in 1879, but this statue was unveiled in the heart of Reykjavik in 1911, just 7 years before Iceland first gained independence. Notably though, during his lifetime, Sigurðsson never actually called for full independence. His concern was more about achieving greater autonomy from Denmark through democratic processes, an arguably slower but ultimately effective path to self-rule. Today, Sigurðsson still receives great affection from the people of Iceland. Many still even refer to him as Jón Forseti, or President Jón, and Iceland's Independence Day, the 17th of June, marks his birthday. The 17th of June was deliberately chosen back in 1944 as the day when Iceland finally declared full independence. The country may have already been granted political autonomy from Denmark back in 1918, but part of the deal then was that the Danish king would remain head of state, and that Denmark would continue to represent Iceland's interests in foreign affairs and defence. This relationship was known as a personal union, 2 states of equal standing, Denmark and Iceland, which were ruled over by the Danish king. But in Iceland's case, it didn't last all that long. The union between Iceland and Denmark came up for review in 1940, and after a national referendum, Icelanders overwhelmingly voted to abolish the union, removing the Danish king and instead establishing the new Republic of Iceland, which began life on the 17th of June 1944. So that's a very brief overview of how Iceland, long ruled by Scandinavian powers across the sea, eventually came to be an independent nation. But here we're now walking along Austurstræti, named for the city's old general post office, and a street which is punctuated by a rather interesting piece of local history. Submerged into the middle of the road just in front of us are the preserved remains of an old stone pier, which dates back to long before the building of the first proper harbour in Reykjavik. We mentioned that before the harbour was built, the sea used to reach a little further inland, and so it was from around this point that boats would enter or exit the water. This stone pier, which is believed to date from around 1884, was built for that very purpose, serving as one of the main entrances to the city of Reykjavik from the sea. But what's even more remarkable is that it remains so perfectly intact today, nearly 150 years later, because for much of the 20th century it was actually covered over by landfill and street building projects. Since unearthed and beautifully preserved, the old stone pier is an important piece of local heritage, and a reminder of just how much Reykjavik has changed over the course of the last century or so. We know that before Skúli Magnasson's day, this city was almost entirely rural, composed of a handful of farmsteads. But even while Reykjavik rose to become Iceland's largest city and a major trading port by the time it first gained independence from Denmark, it's come a very long way since then. The harbour has been expanded over the decades, and surrounding it now are complexes of rather luxurious apartments and modern landmarks, including the striking Harpa concert hall that we're now going to make our way towards. Of course, it wasn't always this way. Reykjavik's harbour, once a crucial part of Iceland's economic fortunes, was historically dominated by cross-sea trade of the relatively few exports that this island had to offer. Iceland, a volcanic island with harsh climates, has little in the way of arable land for farming, and relatively few natural resources, meaning that for most of history, the majority of its population had to make a living through fishing. But of course, under the Danish trading monopoly, there was for a long time little space for this industry to really grow. As a result, as recently as 100 years ago, Iceland remained by far one of the poorest countries in Europe. But things finally began to change as the technological progress and major events of the 20th century unfolded. One of those major events was the Second World War, a period when Iceland, although officially neutral, found itself occupied by a foreign power, this time not from Scandinavia. In 1940, Denmark, at the time still in personal union with Iceland, was invaded by Nazi Germany, and worries began to spread that Iceland, strategically positioned in the middle of the North Atlantic, would also fall into German hands. To prevent this, a month after the German invasion of Denmark, Iceland was invaded by Britain. A force of 700 Royal Marines aboard 4 warships set out from Scotland, and they landed here in Reykjavik Harbour, although there was no battle forthcoming. The British were met with no major resistance from the people of Iceland, and a year after establishing themselves here, they handed the defence of Iceland over to the Americans. Now, the invasion and occupation of Iceland initially caused some consternation. The large number of British and American soldiers on the country's streets led to some friction, but in general, the Second World War is often seen today as the period which actually lifted Iceland's fortunes. To defend the country, the British and Americans started large engineering projects, including the building of Reykjavik Airport, and this brought new employment to Icelanders, all the while creating the infrastructure for a more modern country, which could begin to thrive in the post-war years. Cut to the 21st century, and the once desperately poor Iceland is home to dazzling new landmarks like this, the Harpa Concert Hall. This splendid music venue was opened back in 2011, although at the time it was a particularly controversial project, given that the country was wrestling with its dire financial crisis. Local feelings towards Harpa have warmed in the years since. It's a state-of-the-art venue that dominates this once vacant part of Reykjavik's waterfront, proving a particularly popular spot with tourists, who are drawn to the building's magnificent glass exterior, which sparkles under the sunshine and lights up in a rainbow of colours during the night. The architecture is said to be inspired by Iceland's rocky basalt landscape, giving you a flavour of the wilderness from the comfort of the city. And despite its own rocky ride, the building having originally been conceived a good 40 years before it finally opened, it's fair to say that Harpa is a real treat for anyone wandering into this part of Reykjavik. But of course, even better than striking modern architecture are beautiful natural views, and sitting in the shadow of Harpa is one of the prettiest viewpoints on Reykjavik's waterfront. As we know, the city sits on the southern shore of a small fjord, known as Kollafjörður, itself just a small part of the huge Faxaflói Bay, a large inlet of the North Atlantic Ocean. We know that the bay is teeming with marine life, fish, whales, seals, and everything in between, having provided nourishment to the people who settled along its shoreline through the centuries. Today, the built-up shoreline of Reykjavik is much different, but just here by the water, you might notice a lot of small rocks piled up on top of one another. These are stone cairns, but rather than being some ancient part of Reykjavik's waterfront, they were actually built by tourists, many visitors taking part in a popular craze of constructing the small stone towers. They make for a pretty picture, particularly with the beautiful backdrop of Esjan in the far distance. But cairns are much more than just a tourist craze. They're traditionally used in Iceland to mark passable routes across the country's harsh landscape. Here in modern Reykjavik, there's of course no need for cairns, but even in the 21st century, the vast majority of Iceland poses a real challenge for travelling cross-country. As much as 80% of Iceland is entirely uninhabited, the mountains, volcanoes, glaciers and highlands proving inhospitable to permanent settlement, although on occasion people do still need to travel through the harshest parts of the landscape. Some farmers do rely on cairns to navigate remote parts of the countryside, so for tourists, building cairns is absolutely forbidden when you venture outside of the cities, as harmless as it may seem. Of course, cairns like we see here on Reykjavik's shore are not entirely unique to Iceland. You'll find them all over the world, and the word in English derives from just across the sea in Scotland, a part of the world which has more of a bond with Iceland than first meets the eye. For much of history, Iceland has been most closely linked to Scandinavia, this Nordic nation fully embracing its Viking heritage. But before the first Scandinavians arrived here more than 1,000 years ago, Iceland was home to a tiny population of monks who came from Scotland and Ireland. Now, next to nothing is known about this early Celtic settlement of Iceland, but according to archaeological surveys in parts of Iceland's southern coast, it's believed that these Scottish and Irish monks may have settled here as early as the 7th century, up to 200 years before the first Norsemen arrived. What little we do know about the Celtic settlement of Iceland is briefly referred to in some of the earliest Icelandic sagas, works like the Landnámabók, or the Book of Settlements, which tells the story of how Scandinavian settlers encountered these monks when they first arrived in Iceland. But this early footnote in Icelandic history wasn't the end of Celtic influence. Many people from Britain and Ireland, especially women, were brought here as slaves of the Vikings in the following centuries, and so that's why Icelanders today can actually claim a Celtic ancestry, most clearly evidenced by the higher than average number of people with red hair in this country. But of course, Iceland's Celtic heritage pales in comparison to its Norse heritage, and the early Celtic monks were soon displaced by the permanent settlement of people from Scandinavia. And as we already know, the story goes that the first Norseman to lay down roots here was one Ingólfur Arnarson. And fittingly, here we find ourselves walking up onto a hill which is named after him. This is Arnarhóll, and according to legend, it was at the foot of this hill that the wooden pillars which he threw into the sea were found washed up on shore, marking this out as the first point of permanent settlement in all of Iceland. Covered in snow today, Arnarhóll has had quite the history over the last 1100 years. In fact, in the early 19th century, Jörgen Jörgensen, the Dane who declared himself protector of Iceland, built a makeshift fort atop this hill. But today the peak of the mound is marked by a famous statue of Ingólfur Arnarson himself, depicting him watching over the city and country which he founded centuries ago. Standing by his high seat, and with sword in hand, this statue is an iconic symbol of the early Norse settler, who's not only credited with founding the settlement at Reykjavik, but possibly also naming it. The name Reykjavik literally translates to Smoke Cove, or Smoky Bay, and it's believed that the name comes from the stories of how early Norse settlers spotted plumes of smoke emanating from the landscape as they sailed towards this southwestern corner of Iceland. This smoke was of course geothermal activity on this volcanic island, and so the name Reykjavik was born. Actually, speaking of names, the name of Iceland is also one which has a more interesting story than you might first expect. On a day like today, it's fairly obvious where Iceland gets its name from. But as we take in a view over the city, you'll notice that Arnarhóll is covered not just in ice, but snow. Interestingly, while Ingólfur Arnarson is the man credited as the first permanent settler of Iceland, he wasn't the first Norseman to discover the country. In fact, it was more than half a century before he first arrived here that another Viking, known only as Narrated, first saw this island in the middle of the ocean, covered in a thick layer of white snow. For that reason, Narrated christened this place as Snæland, or Snowland in English. Over the following years as settlement began, Snæland was given a number of different names, one of which was Iceland, Iceland, thought to have been a reference to icebergs which were spotted inside one of the island's many fjords. So those are the stories of both Reykjavik and Iceland's names from the potential site of the very first settlement. But we've now made our way off Arnarhóll, and here we're walking past one of the most beautiful buildings in this city, Safnahúsið, or the House of Collections. Opened back in 1908, this building was for a long time the home of Iceland's National Library and National Archives, but since the 1990s it's been used as an exhibition space, which is now part of the National Museum of Iceland. The building, certainly worth checking out, is gorgeous inside and out, but just outside we can also see the flag of Iceland flying. Iceland's flag has been the nation's official banner since the Republic's founding in 1944. But the flag did exist before then, emerging in the 19th century as Icelandic nationalism began to grow. And the distinctive Nordic cross points to Iceland's Scandinavian heritage, while the colours represent three famous features of Iceland's landscape: white for ice and snow, red for the lava and fire of the island's volcanoes, and blue for the mountains. Here the flag flies before Safnahúsið's neighbour, the rather imposing National Theatre of Iceland, which has stood here in the heart of the city since 1950. Together, all of these buildings just beside Arnarhóll make up the core of Reykjavik's cultural sphere, standing on the major street of Hverfisgata. But once upon a time, this, like many other streets in Reykjavik, was a much grittier, messier place. Stretching eastwards for just over a kilometre from the city centre, Hverfisgata has long been a busy thoroughfare, but it was far from a destination for people to explore as it is today. Before the opening of the House of Collections and the National Theatre, there were few points of cultural interest here, the street instead lined by a more ramshackle collection of local shops, taverns and houses. The street was no prestigious address then, but it did still play host to a number of interesting characters over time. Just here on the street corner, for example, is a house which was once home to a scientist who brought the very first X-ray machine to Iceland in 1914, which was set up right here in this house on Hverfisgata. But although Hverfisgata today is indeed a street well worth exploring, for a long time its reputation meant that it was often seen as a poor man's alternative to Reykjavik's most popular shopping street, which runs parallel just at the top of this slope. This part of the city, which lies just to the east of the Austurvöllur, Alþingishúsið, and most of Reykjavik's oldest political landmarks, is a little more light-hearted, as it's the core of shopping, entertainment and tourist activities, and it's all centred around the street known as Laugavegur, which is lined by dozens of shops, bars and restaurants, the most famous of which is probably the one that we find just here. This is Prikið, one of Iceland's longest-running cafe restaurants, opened all the way back in 1951. The name literally means the stick, although I'm not entirely sure why. But it's a hugely popular venue among locals and visitors alike, famed for its cosy, historic interior, excellent roster of music acts, and always lively atmosphere. Admittedly, it's not the biggest venue, but if there's no space, don't fret. There are plenty more places to stop by on Laugavegur here, one of the oldest, longest, and busiest streets in all of Reykjavik. Around 2 kilometers in length, Laugavegur here began life centuries ago. Its name literally means something like washing road, as it was around here that women on the farmsteads of Reykjavik would bring their laundry to wash in hot natural pools of water. Things are vastly different today though, and Laugavegur lies at the heart of a network of popular modern streets, the most colourful of which is undoubtedly Skólavörðustígur just here, often known to tourists in recent years as Rainbow Road. This is the view of Reykjavik that you'll see in all the guidebooks, and people are always itching to get a photo of themselves standing on the rainbow, with the soaring tower of Iceland's tallest church in the far distance, the mighty Hallgrímskirkja, probably the country's most recognisable landmark in the modern day. Seemingly beckoning us towards it between the buildings, Hallgrímskirkja is about as spectacular as this city gets, and we'll be venturing up to take a closer look at the church and all of its space-age architecture in just under 10 minutes' time, where we'll sadly reach the end of our walk around Reykjavik. But the church was only built in the 1980s, and so while it was once absent from this view, Skólavörðustígur has always been one of Reykjavik's prettiest streets, historically offering views over the whole city and the bay, as it rises up with the terrain. Today buildings obscure that wider view, but just here we do find a building of note. This is Hegningarhúsið, the penalty house, which was built back in 1872 and which served as a prison until extremely recently. It only shut down in 2016. Of course, at the heart of Reykjavik's growing entertainment district, the old prison was a little out of place, once home to 16 cells and an outdoor exercise yard. Though the prison was actually so famous in Iceland that it even inspired a local idiom. Many people often refer to going to prison as fara í steinin, or going to the stone, said to be a reference to the stones of the penalty house in the heart of this city. Here, meanwhile, we've returned to Laugavegur, Reykjavik's main shopping street, along which there stands a wide array of colourful iron-clad houses, many of which do indeed date back over 100 years to that period when they were very much in fashion in the city. Now, Laugavegur may not have the spectacle of a huge church standing at one end, nor even a rainbow painted on the tarmac, but it's still full of colour. This delightful hopscotch on the floor, just one example. It's got 106 squares, quite a daunting prospect for anybody hoping to hop their way down this long shopping street. Of course, as we mentioned, Laugavegur began life as a place where people came to wash their clothes in hot pools of water. But it was eventually laid out as a proper street by the city council in 1885, as the Icelandic capital was beginning to quickly grow in size. The area around the Austurvöllur, historically used as the venue of many of the city's main political sites, was relatively well developed by 1885, but this eastern part of Reykjavik was a little sparser, and so it became the place where locals would come to do their shopping. Laugavegur functioning much like a typical high street that you'd find elsewhere around the world. In recent decades, as Reykjavik's population has spread out even further, and new modern shopping centres have opened up on the outskirts of town, Laugavegur doesn't quite have the same pull for locals that it once did, but it's still abuzz with energy, especially with the large number of tourists who spend time in this part of the city, and the wealth of places to eat and drink as well as shop. Eye-catching murals only add to the area's eclectic character. This house-sized painting artistically depicting the Vikings who gave birth to Iceland all those years ago. But this being a street in the heart of a major entertainment district, Laugavegur is less big on local heritage as it is on nightlife and good times. The street does have a couple of museums, but they're rather unusual. One is dedicated to punk culture, and the other is the weirdly popular Phallological Museum of Iceland, a bizarre collection of genitalia that began as one man's strange hobby. Everybody's into something, I suppose, and it's one of many establishments on this road which keep tourists coming all year round. But as we know, tourism in Iceland is another fairly new phenomenon, and so long before Laugavegur became a visitor hotspot, it was lined with a wide array of humble local businesses, selling all kinds of everyday goods to locals. Just here in red, for example, is a building that for a long time was known as the oldest shop on Laugavegur. It was a hardware and DIY shop named Brynja, and the business moved into this building on Laugavegur all the way back in 1930, and it continued operating right up until 2022. Sadly, rising costs forced the owners to sell the shop on this major city centre street just last year, Reykjavik being one of the most expensive places to live in one of the most expensive countries in the world. Iceland, often described as one of the world's safest and cleanest countries, with an exceptionally high quality of life, is unavoidably pricey. Its small population and geographical isolation, meaning a regime of relatively high taxes, and the need to import many goods from overseas. Strangely though, some things are actually much cheaper in Iceland than elsewhere in the world, most surprisingly heating for people's houses, much of which is actually powered by the rich geothermal energy of this volcanically active island. It's not uncommon for many Icelanders to leave the heating on 24/7, and even when they go away on holiday. That's not the only thing that surprises many people about this country. Not helped by the two polar bears standing outside this souvenir shop, many people think that you will find polar bears in Iceland, but the truth is that there are none, apart from exceptionally rare circumstances where they drift to the country on Arctic sea ice. In fact, Iceland's wilderness, famously dangerous for its volcanoes, harsh weather and more, is surprisingly devoid of dangerous wildlife. The most dangerous animal here is probably the Arctic fox, which, if you somehow run into one, may give you a friendly bite on the hand if you get too close. Otherwise, Iceland's animal life is largely made up of livestock, sheep, cows and reindeer, marine life like whales, seals and of course plenty of fish, and a vast array of bird species, the most famous probably being the puffin, or lundin as it's known in Icelandic. As many as 6 million puffins call Iceland home, and while they can be found on parts of the coast all over the country, your best bet if you're desperate to see one is to visit the Westman Islands, a group of tiny islands that lie just off Iceland's south coast, just over 100 kilometres from Reykjavik here. Sadly, you're unlikely to bump into any puffins on the streets of Reykjavik, but here we've turned off Laugavegur and now find ourselves climbing the hill of Frakkastígur, French Street. We've made much of Reykjavik's Norse origins throughout our walk. The streets of the city are still lined by plenty of those wooden catalogue homes that were built over in Norway. But Frakkastígur tells us that it wasn't only Norwegian houses which were brought here. In the early 1900s, a number of French-built wooden houses were erected in the city, many around this area. But it's not the only reason that this came to be known as French Street. For decades in the 19th and 20th centuries, large numbers of French sailors found themselves in the waters surrounding Iceland, where they would fish, mainly for cod. In the harsh waves of the North Atlantic, however, many French mariners lost their lives while fishing, and so to support those who suffered ill health while out at sea, France sponsored the construction of a hospital at the bottom of this street, the French Hospital, which was built back in 1902. Despite its name, the French hospital was open not just to French sailors, but also local Icelanders. And even after French fishing operations in this part of the world came to an end around 1914, the French hospital remained open for another 13 years, serving as an important piece of infrastructure in the burgeoning city of Reykjavik. As we know, independence in 1918 was followed by slow growth, and then a turning point in the Second World War, which brought modern infrastructure and new jobs to Iceland that left the nation well placed to grow further in the second half of the 20th century. Between the end of the Second World War and the present day, then, Iceland has changed immeasurably, going from one of Europe's poorest countries to one of its wealthiest. And there are few symbols more emblematic of this rise than the iconic Hallgrímskirkja, the soaring, space-age church which we find here at the top of Frakkastígur. As we mentioned, this church, completed back in 1986, is the tallest in Iceland, rising 74.5 metres into the sky, and its construction was an absolutely monumental undertaking. It took 41 years to build the church, from 1945 to 1986, and its mesmerising architecture not only incorporates a tall tower, but also a spacious nave and distinctive curved side wings, made of a series of rising columns which evoke the image of the rocky basalt columns that you'll find all over the country. In my book, it's one of the most beautiful churches in the world, and there's an equally beautiful view if you venture inside and up to the top of its tower, which offers a spectacular panorama over the streets of Reykjavik and the vast surrounding landscape. Being a fairly new church, certainly compared with Reykjavik Cathedral, which we saw at the start of our walk, Hallgrímskirkja may not have a sprawling history just yet, but there are plenty of points of note. For instance, the church takes its name from one of the most prominent poets and religious figures in Icelandic history, one Hallgrímur Pétursson, who lived back in the 17th century. Standing out in front of the church, meanwhile, is a statue of an especially famous man who was likely born in Iceland, Leif Erikson, who's often touted as the first European to have set foot on the mainland North American continent. Erikson was born in Iceland back in the late 10th century, and he travelled widely across the far reaches of the North Atlantic, including Greenland and what later became Canada. Some even say that he founded a settlement in modern-day Newfoundland more than 1,000 years ago, and centuries before Christopher Columbus first set foot in America. This now famous statue of Erikson was given to Reykjavik by the people of the United States back in 1930, as a gift to commemorate the 1000th anniversary of the establishment of the Alþingi, the Icelandic parliament with which we began our walk. An hour later, having strolled through the streets, gazed out over the sea, and just about scratched the surface of Reykjavik and Iceland's rich culture and history, we've sadly come to the end of our walk, here in the shadow of the mighty Hallgrímskirkja. All I have left to say is a very big takk fyrir. Thank you very much for tuning in and watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed discovering the history and seeing some sights from the world's northernmost capital city. And I hope you're now eagerly planning your own trip to snowy Reykjavik sometime soon.